I was touching myself by the pool to pictures of his friend. When my husband got home, he exploded. Hello, Reddit. I never thought I'd find myself in such a sinful situation, and I don't know exactly what came over me. As a married woman, I feel very shameful, and it's even more embarrassing that I did what I did. Being sad, broken, and filled with regret is an understatement. But I won't let my emotions stop me from acknowledging that I made the wrong choice, and no one in their right mind should do the same. Saying yes to commitment, faithfulness, and loyalty to the man of your dreams is easy, but keeping those promises can sometimes be very difficult because temptations will come, and that's exactly what happened to me. I should have prayed for the strength to resist and avoid it, but instead I gave in, and my life has been miserable since then. I am not the type of woman to condone any form of cheating, and to be sincere, before this happened to me, I never even tried to understand women who did things like this. I always told them they had a choice, but look at me now, in that same situation, and now I understand that I can't really judge them. Honestly, I am not making any excuses to cover up what I did. It's just that this thing called emotions, feelings, they have a way of messing with your head. Oh no, I don't even know what to say. But I think anyone who's been in a similar situation would understand where I'm coming from. I feel truly sorry for everything, and I hope my husband understands that I am truly sincere. So how this started was when my husband made a shocking statement about bringing a friend over, and it was impossible to hear that from him, but then I was happy for the change. This was the first time in 3 years of our marriage that has ever happened. So I was surprised, but glad when my husband called me one evening, telling me he would bring a friend home for dinner. I was really looking forward to it because my husband was not the kind of person who had a lot of friends or had friends come over. He was distant and reserved. But upon hearing this, I got excited. Normal excitement, nothing more. I prepared dinner and dressed my best. We hardly had guests over. My husband had colleagues but no real friends, at least none he brought home, so I thought this one must be really special. And when he returned home that evening, he came home with Scott. I couldn't believe how beautiful this man was. His beauty was out of this world. I'm not saying my husband was not good looking. He was handsome, but Scott had this dangerous beauty to him that I couldn't explain. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about him, and I also couldn't understand why I was feeling that way. The way he talked, sure, although my husband was part of the conversation, it was as if we were speaking in a different language my husband couldn't understand. Eyes were communicating in ways only souls could understand. Perhaps it was just my way of seeing things or understanding the way I felt that evening each time he smiled at me, each time his eyes landed on me. From that night on, I was always happy to see Scott. I anticipated my husband's calls concerning him. I always looked forward to him telling me that Scott was coming over for dinner, and that did happen a lot of times because my husband and Scott became very close. Anytime my husband informed me, I'd spent more time picking out my outfit, choosing my perfume, making sure my hair was just right. In my head, it was just about being a good host. That was all, although I was hoping to make a good impression each time he was around. Normally, I shouldn't have felt that way. I don't know why I started feeling that towards someone that's not my husband. And it only got worse as time went by. One day, when we were at the dinner table, having one of my dishes, I remember Scott and I sitting on opposite sides of the table. My husband sat at the head of the table and was enjoying the food as we all talked, but Scott and I were lost in each other's eyes. When he smiled, I knew it wasn't the jokes that my husband was making. I knew that it was something in my eyes. He couldn't resist me like my eyes were made of some kind of enchanting material that he could not get his eyes off. He couldn't stop blushing, and I couldn't either. He looked at me like I was the most intriguing thing in the world, and I looked at him like I had seen the most shiny thing in the entire universe. I was so attracted to him that I was worried that I was getting addicted to him, because whenever I didn't see him for some time, I got worried, frustrated, and impatient. I was married, but I found myself falling in love with another man. Then, at some point later on, Scott began inviting us over to his place for dinner. It was the most intriguing and amazing thing that happened to me at that time. Just thinking about it is funny and childish. I was so carried away by this man that I felt like a teenage girl visiting her crush's house for the first time. And the things that I discovered when I got to his house were nothing short of shocking. I looked around, but I didn't see any wedding pictures or pictures of him and his girlfriend. It was like I had walked into the house of the most eligible bachelor of the entire world. I couldn't believe it. Scott was single. How the hell was that possible? Well, as impossible as it sounded, it made things a lot more interesting for me. I asked myself how a man so captivating with his words and his look could be single. It didn't make any sense in this world or the next. And naturally, I got curious, but I didn't make my curiosity known. I frequently reminded myself that I was married to just keep myself in check. I needed to keep myself in line because I didn't want things to get out of hand. But that was very difficult to do. Especially as we were eating at Scott's dinner table, I was lost in his lips. The way he chewed his food with finesse and smiled as he talked, it was a perfect mixture of charisma and beauty. It felt like I was having a meal at the same table as an angel. It's safe to say that I was lost. I didn't say anything that first night at his house, but I knew my inquisitive nature would take hold of me sooner or later. And it did so sooner than I expected, during one of our hangouts together. I told Scott that I had noticed that he was single. This sparked a whole conversation between the two of us. He asked me how I came to that conclusion, and I told him what I had noticed the first time I came into his house. He laughed and told me that he was indeed single. I asked him why he was single because I couldn't wrap my head around it. I even asked him if he didn't believe in marriage or relationship. He laughed and told me that he hasn't found the right person yet, and when he does, he would settle down. That was an okay answer, though, although I was not satisfied, but I also didn't want to push because I didn't want him or my husband to make something of the situation, because I had no concrete reasons for interfering. So all my questions and discussions with him were normal surface-level conversations, nothing deep. Then, one time, I tried reaching my husband, but I couldn't contact him. All his numbers were not reachable, and I didn't know where he was. I even called his work phone, but I couldn't reach him through that phone either. I felt restless and impatient. I was desperate, so I did the only thing I could think of, which was calling Scott. But that proved to be difficult because I didn't have his number. I know, it was odd. He was my husband's friend, and we had all been over at each other's place multiple times, yet somehow I didn't have his number. So then I went through his laptop in hopes of getting Scott's number. At first, when I searched for the name, I saw a few contacts named Scott, and since I didn't know Scott's nickname, I ended up calling all of them. Whenever I called one of the numbers, I wouldn't say anything until the person spoke. After about 3 calls, I heard a cool voice that said, "Hello." I knew it was him instantly, and I smiled. I found it, and it felt like the most satisfying thing I had done in a long time. It felt like a hunt that I came out victorious in. I spoke with thirst in my voice and introduced myself. He told me that I didn't need to do that because he already knew my voice. I was flattered he knew my voice. He then asked me what gave him the honor of me calling him. I was speechless for a few seconds. I had completely forgotten why I was even looking for his number in the first place. Just then, I heard my husband's voice in the background of the call, and my brain was instantly rebooted. Scott and my husband were around each other, and I immediately told Scott that I couldn't reach my husband, so I called him instead. He chuckled and told me that I should hang on a second. Then he passed his phone over to my husband. Sure, I didn't talk for long with Scott that day, but that was the beginning of something dramatic. Now I had Scott's number. My heart raced out of strange excitement. The next step was to find ways to communicate with him without making it look suspicious, so at first it was just out of necessity. When I couldn't reach my husband, I called Scott. That was the excuse I gave myself, that it was just to pass a message, just to ask where my husband was. But then I started calling even when I knew I could reach my husband. Sometimes I lied. I told Scott I couldn't get through to my husband, just to have an excuse to talk to him. One evening, I called Scott, and my first words to him were asking if my husband was with him. He first laughed and told me that I was getting obvious. I knew what that meant, but I pretended not to. I told him that I didn't understand what he meant, and he told me that my husband's phone is always on, and that I could reach my husband whenever I want to. But I always choose to call him instead. He said he wasn't complaining, that he liked hearing my voice too, but that I was being very obvious. I ended the call without saying a word. I didn't know what I was feeling, but it was something along the lines of embarrassment and blushes. He was clearly a smart man, and he was right. I was being too obvious. He called me a few minutes later, and I was so anxious to pick up, but I finally did, and all he said was that he was glad I called. Then he ended the call. I almost exploded. I couldn't believe it. I blushed and I smiled without control, and before I knew it, I was lost in thought of how I liked the way his voice sounded. I liked the way he spoke to me, the tone of his voice, and the way every conversation with him made me feel, no matter how short the conversation was. The next day, I called him, and I smiled immediately I heard his voice. He asked me if I wanted to speak to my husband, and I took a few seconds before I said no. He didn't say anything as well for a few seconds, and the next thing he asked me was if I was sure. I took a deep breath and confirmed that I was sure. He chuckled lightly and told me that my husband wasn't even with him, so if I wanted to speak to my husband, he wouldn't be able to help me. He asked me how my day was, and I gave him a brief version of what my day was like. Then I asked him, and as he spoke, I started recording his voice. The funny thing is that this wasn't a one-time act. We began talking a lot more frequently over the phone, and each time we spoke, I'd record his voice. Most times, I'd ask him a question that I knew was going to cause him to talk a lot, just because I wanted to listen to him talk and record while listening. I don't even know why I did it. But then it was because I wanted to hear it again, and I liked the way it made me feel. So I kept doing it, and I didn't want to stop. His voice was a turn on to me, and sometimes, when I was alone, I played it out loud, and it made me feel horny. So the next thing I did was fantasized about having fun with him while pleasuring myself. I loved the feeling, I loved every moment of it, and I couldn't bring myself to stop. Trust me, I really tried, but it didn't work, and I feel ashamed to admit that. I remember when he called me. Yes, he began calling me sometimes. I asked him if he wanted to talk to my husband. It was our routine joke, but if I'm being honest, it was a little more than that. I think it was a code we used to know if my husband was around any of us. It's not like we agreed on some kind of secret code or question, it just became a thing. After I asked Scott that question, he chuckled, and nothing could have prepared me for what he said next. He said he missed me. I was stunned. I knew how he felt, at least perhaps because of how we couldn't stop talking to each other. But I always thought if someone ever became obvious with their feelings, it would be me. He told me he missed me, and I know it's not some grand declaration of feelings, and I know it's not the 3 words everyone wants to hear from their lover or their spouse, but at that point it carried the weight of a million I love yous wrapped in one. Sure, I had been trying to hold up a wall, but after he said that, the seemingly strong wall that I was building melted like a candle placed before a fiery furnace. And like that furnace, my desire for him burned even more without any end in sight. I was lost in admiration and lust for him, that whenever I couldn't sleep, I'd wear headphones and listen to recordings of his voice. His voice was my white noise, my ASMR. It helped me relax and allowed me to sleep so peacefully. And as such, our folly companionship went on, and soon I was no longer satisfied with just hearing his voice. I just wanted to see him. I had developed this massive crush on him. No, describing what I felt for him as a crush would probably be the biggest understatement I have made in the past decade. In all honesty, I was in love with Scott. And mind you, it wasn't the innocent kind of love. It was rather dangerous, consuming, the kind that produced sparks and set entire bedrooms ablaze, the kind that made me lick my lips when I heard his voice, the kind that made my blood flow a tad bit faster when he asks me how I am. I was closing in on obsession, which was why, when I heard my husband's company was having a dinner party, I was more than happy. My husband was beyond shocked when I said I wanted to go because I never liked going to work parties. I always said they were boring and that I wasn't interested in being bored to death. But this time, I didn't want to miss it, and that was because of Scott. He hadn't come around in a while because of his busy schedule. This was my only chance to see him. I had to seize it because there was no other way. It's not like I could outrightly ask my husband to let me go see Scott. I couldn't just show up at his apartment. I had no reason to do that. Like I said, my husband knew how much I disliked these events, and he was really surprised, although he didn't ask why. He didn't stop to question it. He was just happy that I finally agreed to go with him. I dressed in my best, and we hung out with Scott at the dinner party. When I saw him, it took a miracle of discipline and principles not to jump on him and hug him so tightly. It was so hard controlling myself like that. This was the man I'd spend hours on call with, and now that we were face to face, we couldn't even express how we feel properly to each other. But we did try as much as we could. I took a lot of pictures with Scott that day. My husband was in some of the pictures, but most of the pictures were just Scott and me. We talked a lot. Yes, my husband was part of the conversation, but he had to go answer some calls, meet some people, but Scott knew what he was doing and stayed by my side. I was so happy talking to Scott as I couldn't directly express my feelings to him. I couldn't. I didn't want to embarrass myself or cheat on my husband because it was not right, so talking to him was okay. I had to manage that, and Scott gave me his undivided attention, and after that night, I found myself thinking about Scott in ways I shouldn't. When he was talking, my brain would phase out and begin imagining the most outrageous things. I pictured both of us in bed together and him doing things that only my husband should be allowed to do to me, and I don't even allow my husband do most of those things to me. It goes without saying that I was willing to let myself go for Scott. After that work dinner, I began dreaming about things I shouldn't. The imaginations I had while talking to Scott at the work dinner got a lot worse. Everything I saw made me think of him in a very inappropriate manner. I once took a bit of a delicious cake and let out a soft moan to express my appreciation for the deliciousness of the baked goods, but immediately the moan left my mouth. I thought to myself that I would have loved it if Scott was the one making me moan like that. I couldn't hold myself back any longer, and that is just one instance of many. I was getting to a boiling point where I had to let things out. Little did I know that letting things out was going to be my downfall. One day, I was sitting by the pool when I felt this tingle within me. I tried to ignore it. I tried listening to music, seeing a movie on my phone, and even swimming, but nothing was working. I knew what I wanted, or at least what my body wanted, and that was to feel good. That's putting it lightly. I wanted Scott to make me feel good because he was the only person that could make me feel the way I needed to. I lost all my discipline and principles and self-control. It was like they all took a nosedive to the bottom of the 8-foot pool, and before I knew it, I pulled out my phone and went through the pictures of Scott and I. The way he puts his hands around my waist in the picture just made me feel elated. I soon began touching myself while looking at the pictures of him, and to top it all off, I played a recording of his voice. I was walking on clouds, and nothing could stop me. I moaned aloud out loud, feeling the best I had felt in a very long time. At that moment, the world fell away from me, and I felt as though I had elevated from this earthly plane. But before I knew it, I heard my husband's voice call out my name from behind, and I was so startled that my phone fell from my hand and into the pool. I immediately turned to look at him, and his face was red. He was clearly bitter with rage, and I was sure he wanted to pulverize me at that point. He called my name again, looking into my eyes like he was still trying to make sense of what he walked in on. He exploded in anger, and I felt every bit of his rage that day. Now I am frustrated and lost, and I am worried that I may have single-handedly destroyed my marriage. I don't know why I did what I did, but truly, I need to know what I can do to sweeten and soften my husband's heart, because at this point, I am so scared. I just need a way to make everything go back to normal. Update. It's been a few months since my sins were laid bare for my husband to witness, and as you can imagine, he was furious and bitter. And in his rage, he put our house on the market. Yes, the house we were living in together as husband and wife. It was the most shocking thing that had happened to me, other than him walking in on me pleasuring myself to pictures of his friend. We paid for the house together, and he clearly didn't want to live with me anymore. He even told me that he was going to sell the house to anyone willing to pay a fair price for it, and that the only way he wouldn't sell the house was if I was going to buy his own share of the house. I had some money saved, but not enough to pay off the house and make it completely mine. I begged and begged him, but he refused to listen to me or forgive me. And to make matters worse, I heard he fought with Scott at work. Thankfully, none of them was fired, but they were both transferred to different branches of the company. I keep expecting my husband to divorce me, since he said he would never forgive me, but he refused to. He told me that I would be bound to him and never be free to do what I want, even though we're separated. My life went from normal to shambles in the blink of an eye, and the tragic thing is that Scott avoided me. I would have thought that he would come back to me, even after the fight he had with my husband, but he didn't. I can't even contact him, so I'm so confused. It's like he cursed me out of his life. My life is a shadow of what it used to be. I don't know how long my husband will keep punishing me with his actions. So I'll just be patient and pray that he forgives me one day and loves me back the way he did before all this ever happened. This would probably be my last update. I'm going to take some time to understand myself and make sure I never do what I did again.